Hey, Macca.
Yeah.
How many configuration manager administrators does it take to absolutely destroy a bit of industrial process equipment that means that you are actually frog marched out of the company Christmas party in front of your family?
All right, I think we'll put that one over to the audience. How many do you reckon? One.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. Many people. Now, this is your absolution slide. This is where I'm absolving you of all responsibility for what's happened with Configuration Manager. Because how many people here work with a Configuration Manager environment that someone else set up?
That does not surprise me in the least. And just as a follow-on to that, hands up if you've still got Band-Aids from that solution on your person right now. How often do you have to reapply those right now? Who's been doing this since Config Manager 2007? Get your hand up if it was 2003.
SMS.
SMS, anyone? Have we seriously got no SMS people in the room? Yeah, come on. SMS 2. Who's been doing it since SMS 2?
We're all,
right.
Most of us are middle-aged here. We can admit to being in IT in the 90s.
We can handle that.
Okay, we're on-prem. We're not all of these cloud sort of, all funky and all of that. We're on-prem administrators. We're talking about Configuration Manager. It's okay to admit to have been in the job for a while.
And I'd just like to hear who's been doing it since 1.0. Because you are the inaugural recipient of the Config Manager Bleeding Heart Award as given out by us at Ignite 2016. So congratulations for sticking with it as long as you had. You're probably going to know most of this already, but for everybody else, hopefully we've got some interesting stuff for you today.
So one of the other things that we're getting across and one of the other things we're absolving you of is that you will probably recognise some of the configuration eccentricities that we're going to talk about in this session. And you can just simply blame the consultant because it's always a highly paid, swanky consultant that put in your Configuration Manager deployment, isn't it? Yeah, exactly, right? Okay, now, Configuration Manager is a complicated product. We know that. Configuration Manager is an extremely unforgiving product. But using Google to solve Configuration Manager problems can tip you from out of the frying pan into the eternal blast furnace of incineratey, burny death.
It's actually a really, really fun way to play Russian roulette. When something goes wrong with your Config Manager infrastructure, stick it in Google, because you can guarantee that 50 or 60 other people have seen the problem and they've all got their own opinion as to what the issue is.
And the approach of, I'm going to type it into Google, and I'm going to look at the thing and think, that sounds reasonable. I'm going to go and apply that solution to my Configuration Manager environment, can lead to a lot of pain.
Don't think that a Bing search is going to be any better either.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through 30 things that we've heard that real people have done or that we've seen that you shouldn't do. And we'll kind of explain why you shouldn't do it that way. So the first one here, and tell me if you recognise this, is that everybody who uses the Configuration Manager console does not need to be a full administrator.
I know that might be hard to believe. And to be honest, those of you that have been doing this for a while know why you're running as full administrator. Does anyone remember the concept of class and instance rights in Config Manager 2007 and earlier? Like, easily the most confusing, unnecessary set of permissions we've ever come up with in our entire lives at Microsoft. And these things go back to SMS 1.0 when someone said, you know what, that NTFS stuff looks pretty good, but why do we only want to give them 5 permissions? Let's give them 15 permissions for every single class, and let's have somewhere around 30 classes that we can give you permission to. And let's get to a point where you're in this horrible, ugly mesh of disgustingness when you're trying to figure out exactly what it is you want to do inside that Configuration Manager console, that you get to a point where you go, okay, I do not care anymore. I'm just going to make myself full administrator. And in the day, fantastic, your SMS console opened. And sometimes it worked as well, which was awesome.
And we completely understand. It's sort of like in the other session I'm giving on Friday about 30 bad habits of server systems administrators and cloud administrators. Of course, I'm talking about let's put everybody in the domain admins group. But full administrator is a very common mistake with Configuration Manager. Now, you can go very, very, very detailed with Configuration Manager and apply permissions to scopes. But before you even go to that level of granularity, this is all of the roles that are built into Configuration Manager. No one needs to be a full administrator, right? You're full administrator if you're the person who set it up, and that's the account that's there by default. But there's two groups that you should be looking at. Operations Administrator, which is over here.
It does everything except being able to play around with the security settings.
And then you've got Security Administrator, which should only really be busted out in the times where you need to go and reassign one of these roles. But you can do everything you want as an operations administrator, and even that is overprivileged, because what you should be thinking about and what you should be remembering is that the approach now of attackers isn't to hack the infrastructure, it's to hack the admin. And if you've heard of things like pass-the-hash attacks, you know that people are after these sort of accounts. And to give you an example of an attack that was done against an organisation using a solution like this, who's heard of the Target hack in the United States? Who understand? Okay, so the Target hack's really cool, because what the hackers did was they took control of the operating system deployment infrastructure that deployed an operating system image every night to a register. And what they did is they infected the operating system image with basically malware that would capture the credit card details that were passing through that register. So the organisation had an awesome system where they would just wipe and load every day, every register in the United States. So what the attackers did is they made sure every time the new image was loaded, it was pre-infected with malware. So that's one of the reasons why you need to make sure you lock things down. If you've got people who are just responsible for software updates, you put them over in Software Update Manager. If you've got people who are just responsible for endpoint protection, you put them over there. This is mostly your colleagues you're talking about, but you're also thinking about yourself, because you don't need those permissions. And if your account gets compromised, it'll be your account. It's your account thereafter, right? If someone's attacking your organisation, they want your credentials because you've got all the power. And if you relinquish some of that, the amount of damage that can be done can be reduced.
And the other thing I'd be thinking of too is if you've got any really, really junior config manager people that have only just started working with this product, don't put them in a role that lets them anywhere near a task sequence. That's all I'll say.
And the other thing is, one of the things that we see a lot of with Configuration Manager, certainly when you're training Configuration Manager, is that there's a lot of organisations where a consultant has come in and deployed something like Configuration Manager, and it's the consultant that's built it, and then what the organisation does is it chooses some random staff and they send them off on 2 weeks training, and then they're the Configuration Manager administrators. And they're coming in with that level of understanding of the product, which is fine, but Configuration Manager, as I said, is an insanely complicated product. So it takes you a certain amount of blood, sweat and tears before you understand that deploying task sequences can actually really, really get you in trouble. It's sort of like handing a gun to a 2-year-old. Okay, here's another thing. Network access accounts, client push accounts, and network domain join accounts do not need to be members of the domain administrator group.
Very, very true.
We've seen this. This is what people do. They go, oh, I'm configuring service accounts. What's the easiest way to do permissions for a service account? We'll make a domain administrator, won't we? It'll all work then.
Yeah. Because all a network access account really needs to do, for instance, is go and access a UNC for the purpose of being able to proxy across a request to get access to some source files or something like that from a DP. And ultimately, what we see a lot of is when people are setting this up in proof of concept environments and stuff like that, and they don't necessarily have complete control or are in charge of all of that underlying infrastructure, they run into access problems with lower level accounts. And so rather than actually talking to another member of the IT team, heaven forbid, they go, beauty, we'll just make it a domain admin, gets it out of my hair, and now I can move on. But unfortunately, that has a whole bunch of other things that are going to cascade along with it a little bit further down the track.
So we've got a couple around these, the client push, the network access account, and these service accounts that basically you use to do stuff. So make sure you lock down the network access account. And the reason for this, again, I was talking about pass the hash a moment ago. The network access account credentials are stored in a way that are retrievable from any machine in your organisation that has the Config Manager client installed. So Macca was just saying, all it needs to be able to do is read from the DP share, right? If you make it a member of the domain admins, or if you make it a privileged account, what someone can do is they can use a tool like Mimikatz to go through, extract the credentials of that account, and then they've got access to that account. And whatever that account can do, they can go and do. You'll have heard about in Windows 10 a new feature called Credential Guard, which basically protects user account credentials. Well, in the long run, that's what you'd be wanting to do, but your environments aren't going to be there for a couple of years yet. But remember, when you're thinking about the way that these accounts are configured, remember that this one, there's already code out there that you can run to extract the network account credentials from any computer that's got the Config Manager client installed. The other one, use separate accounts for these 3 primary Config Manager services. All the time, Configuration Manager administrators and consultants that go into organisation look at these 3 accounts and they're all set up with the same service account. What someone does is that they go and create a vanilla user account, they might add it to the domain admins group, and then they use the same vanilla user account for all of these accounts. What you need to do is you need to realise that each one of these accounts needs a separate set of permissions and a separate account because they're a separate set of permissions.
There are a whole bunch of reasons aside from that as to why you want to do this as well. Now, I know it's a pain having to set up multiple user accounts like this, but when you think about it, if you want to be able to do half-decent forensic auditing, you want to have all of these accounts completely separated. These accounts all need differing levels of permissions on the end stations or on various areas of the network to do what they've got to do. So if we look at client push, a client push installation account needs to be able to install software on a local machine. So it does need to have a certain amount of privilege on that local machine in order to do it. Does it necessarily need to have those privileges on any servers in the network? Well, depending on what you're doing with client push, maybe, maybe not. But we certainly want to separate that out from network access, because if we need to start monitoring and getting an understanding of what's happening with that account, and the network access account is exactly the same, then we have a large pool of information that is going to start giving us false positives potentially and moving us away from where the issues might be occurring. So definitely you want to split those out, absolutely.
So if you've inherited the Configuration Manager installation, these are some of the things that you should go and look at. Especially with service accounts, and again, it's something I'll talk about more on Friday, is that people don't tend to configure service accounts very well. What they tend to do is they go and create a standard user, and then they don't think about it anymore. One of the first things you do to lock down a service account is you block it from the logon locally right, because attackers are looking for service accounts that have the logon locally right, because a service account never needs interactive logon on a workstation. Make sure that they have the appropriate rights, and there's documents up. All you have to do is go Config Manager, Accounts, Rights, and there's a big page that'll tell you exactly what you need to do. Now, it's fiddly. It does take time, but that's your job as an administrator, is to go and correctly configure these things. And those are things that are very difficult to automate, because you've got to go into group policy to set it up. You've got to go in and set up a whole lot of other bits and pieces. But if you've inherited a Config Manager installation, or if you've moved to a new organisation and they've got Config Manager, this is one of the things that you do when you're going through it for the first time, to look how that other person's set it up. Because what you don't know can come and bite you.
And can bite you very, very hard indeed. And this last point on this slide here is something I want to point out. They don't need the logon locally right. So often we see the client push installation account with the logon locally right. And that comes from a long throwback to earlier versions of SMS where that would occasionally be true. No longer true. We don't need to worry about that anymore.
No. So remember that when someone is doing the post-incident report, they are going to, if you've got a really big, like what happened at that particular bank, needless to say, there was a big investigation. It wasn't just a one-off act of lunacy, right? And there are so many stories about it. This one got on the news because of the size of the bank involved and the fact that the head of a particular IT company flew right across the Pacific to apologise to the head of that bank in their office for completely trashing things. But this sort of thing does happen on a regular basis. The number of times I've heard of stories similar to, oh, we deployed a task sequence that went and formatted the hard drives, is embarrassing. I mean, I wish there was it'd be nice if Config Manager was sort of user-friendly enough that it'd stop you from doing that, but it's not, okay? It's like a chainsaw. You do not hand a chainsaw to a 5-year-old unless you're expecting some sort of hospital visit later.
Or you're trying to make a viral YouTube video.
Okay, so let's talk about the way that we actually architecture Config Manager. And some of this is stuff around if you were doing a greenfields deployment. So this first one is, if you aren't really sure what a central administration site is, you probably don't need one.
Absolutely. And to be honest, these days it's a hell of a lot easier to make this distinction, because when Config Manager 2012 first came out, we didn't have the ability to retroactively add a CAS onto a primary site if we decided to throw one out there straight away. But these days we don't have that problem. Primary sites have a very large scalability factor.
They will take 150,000 clients.
150,000 clients. Now, hands up in the room if 150,000 clients is enough for you. Sweet. So we're looking pretty good. So fundamentally, in the room, we can get away with a single primary site, barring any other logistical factors, any other political factors, or any other regulatory factors. There is no need for you to have a CAS. And as Oren says, if you don't know what a CAS is, you definitely don't need one. Now, if we do decide at some point that we're going to have more than 150,000 clients, these days we can retroactively add a CAS on top of a standalone primary site, so we're not restricted anymore. We no longer need to go and build CASs just for the sake of it. You may, depending on your topology, need secondary sites, depending on whether or not we need essentially localised versions of management points on geographically distributed environments, but that's another story completely.
Well, yeah, but it's one, because we won't touch on secondaries again. Look, secondaries are something that you probably do need, but think about it before you do, because there's a lot of stuff that you can do just with a primary site if you configure boundaries properly. I've worked with people that have a whole lot of retail locations, and they needed a DP out at each retail location. And there's a 50 secondary site limit on the amount of secondary sites they had, and they had like 180 retail locations. But even then, they were able to work out their secondary sites so that one secondary site would encompass several retail locations. Do your boundaries make sense?
And who loves boundaries in this room? Didn't think so. Yep.
Okay, so the first problem with boundaries is that boundaries take their intelligence about your network operation from your Active Directory sites and services. Who here has a friend who has only got default first site name in Active Directory users and computers? Who has never ever gone and, their friend has never ever, even though they have multiple sites, configured an additional site in Active Directory. Anybody know anybody like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see a lot.
So what Config Manager does is that Config Manager goes and looks at Active Directory and goes, well, they reckon they've only got a site. Let's go and do that. So a great story I heard, and I've used the example of Hobart and Wellington, was there was a guy who had a Config Manager deployment in the state of Queensland. And he had clients in a city called Roma. And Roma is sort of about 1,000 kilometres to the west of Brisbane. And then he had a site in Cairns, which is about 1,000 kilometres north of Brisbane. And their boundary configuration was configured so that Cairns and Roma were in the same boundary, even though both of them only had a WAN link down to Brisbane. So every time they were trying to deploy packages, the clients in Roma were trying to pull it off the distribution point in Cairns. Needless to say, that was not a quick operation.
And if you're familiar with boundaries, you know that when anyone within a single boundary, it's presumed that we have fast connectivity between those two locations. In other words, basically LAN-style connectivity. So when we're looking at actually trying to grab that information from that DP, we're more than likely just going to pull using SMB rather than using bits and HTTPS. So that can cause you a lot of problems. Now, we're well aware that boundaries are not only restricted to doing Active Directory boundaries. We can do, IP subnet and a whole bunch of other things like that. But we see an awful lot of implementations where the easiest way to have done the boundaries is just to set up the Active Directory forest discovery boundary. Off we go. We do it that way, base them on the Active Directory forest. And of course, when you've got that poorly defined sites and services infrastructure, that's where you start running into problems straight away. And you can't necessarily blame the config manager administrator for this, because if the config manager administrator is not an AD administrator and is only going on what the AD team is telling that particular person, then we end up in a really bad place through no fault of the config manager administrators themselves.
So that's another one that you need to check if you're going in and looking at a new config, if you're basically working with a config manager deployment that's alien to you, that you didn't set up, that you don't know where all of the knobs are, where all of the bells are, where all of the whistles are. Now, discovery is an interesting one because there is more than a couple of organisations where consultants have come in because stuff's not being found. And it's simply during that initial process of setting up Config Manager that someone has not configured it to go out and discover users in the forest or computers in the forest.
Absolutely. And quite often you see Active Directory user discovery turned on, but not group discovery. You see system discovery turned on quite often. Sometimes you've had people sitting there wanting to play around with heartbeat discovery. Don't know why, but they want to do that anyway. And you just really need to make sure you understand what your discovery methods do, what they actually find, and what you expect to see in the console after they run. But you also need to think very carefully about how often you want to run these things as well. Right? Do you really need to be running a discovery of your Active Directory users every 5 minutes? Probably not. And if you are going to do that, do you really need to run a full discovery every 5 minutes? Is that really necessary? I mean, is your HR changing that often? Do you really want to work in a company where everybody's leaving every 5 minutes? Probably not. So maybe you want to do a delta instead. So these are things you want to think about, because ultimately that discovery agent is going to be a single-threaded process, and if you're smashing the bejesus out of it every 5 minutes, it's not going to be very happy with you.
So we've got a bit more on this idea of collections and a bit more on the idea of how often things need to be updated, because this is actually an area where people really, really, really mess up Configuration Manager and make it stop working. But one of those sort of overriding principles that you need to get into your head, and of course you're all really experienced administrators, so I'm of course preaching to the choir here, is that Configuration Manager is not an instantaneous solution. It's that you cast the spell and eventually something will happen.
The best way to describe Config Manager is it's like a teenager. Essentially what happens with Config Manager is you tell it to do something and it goes, huh? Yeah. And goes back to catching Pokemon. And then you go, come on, you got to get this done. Huh? Huh? Yeah, no worries. And then eventually you kick it in the guts so hard that it gets up and actually begrudgingly goes and does what you've got to do. Now, it's a lot better than it used to be, right? So it's almost like a reformed teenager these days. With Config Manager, sometimes you can tell it to do something, and sometimes it actually will go and do it straight away.
Without having to, threaten about turning off its Wi-Fi so it can't access social networks, and you're destroying its entire social life, and why do you hate me so much?
This is true.
But that's something to keep in mind, that Config Manager is not going to be instantly responsible. And some people who come in and first using it are going, and it's great, if you're ever teaching a Config Manager course at a CPLS, you're sitting there and you're dealing with a structure of a course that's really designed for things to happen automatically. You do something in the console, you see the result, right? What you've got to do is, okay, you've seen that, now go out and get some cake. Have your cake and maybe some lunch and come back and look, it works.
Unfortunately, with those type of courses, you end up generally having some kind of sugar hypo about one day into it because you're continually having to go out and eat cake.
So the record in the Brisbane office of DDLS is 32 Magnum ice creams in a day. Don't know how that guy didn't end up in a diabetic coma, but anyway, let's talk about collections. Collections do not need to be updated every 15 minutes. Certainly not a full update, right? If you go and do something like this, the first thing to understand is that the collection evaluator is single-threaded. It works on one collection at a time, right? It's got to go through one collection, before it moves to the next collection. And what happens is if you have every collection in your organisation updating on a frequent basis, it never gets to finish. And so what happens is that your collections never properly update. A good rule of thumb is that you should give about 4 hours for a collection to update, because you've got to give the evaluator the ability to go through and evaluate the members of the collection and then move on to your next collection. And the more collections you have, the more time you should give it.
Yep. So I have actually seen a customer that had 400 collections fully updating every 5 minutes and wondered why no collection ever had anything in it.
Because all that happens is the evaluator goes through and it's hitting the database and it's doing all of that and it's talking to clients, and it never gets to the point where it reports back to the collection and says, this is your new membership.
And it effectively starts again every 5 minutes. Right, I've got 5 minutes to do all 400 of these. You beauty. Let's go for the first one. Oh, shit. I'm 2.5 minutes in. Let's go for the second one. I've run out of time. Let's start on the first one because we've got to go all over again. It's not very good.
Okay, and there's people that sit there and you see them. If you go to the Configuration Manager forums, you see, my collections aren't updating. Look at how frequently I'm getting it to do it. And someone's going, yeah, and I've got a really great quote from the forums in a second.
And you know you're desperate once you've hit the forums, right? Because we all know about the quality of the support you get in those forums.
And the idea that there is somehow wisdom out there that's got enough time to actually sit there and go, yes, I will go to the forum and I will post an answer to your problem. Occasionally you get a good answer, but generally, unless someone, I mean, and I know the Microsoft forums have a sort of reputation system that sort of helps with this, but generally if you're desperate enough to post in a forum, you're desperate enough to take the most reasonable sounding quick answer that comes back to you, even if it's even if it's going to destroy your infrastructure, basically.
I've often thought we could just hand the forums over to Tay, just reactivate Tay again and just give her access to all the forums and get her to answer everything.
Does everybody remember Tay, which was Microsoft's conversational bot that they put on social media and it turned into a sort of a xenophobic Nazi in about...
It's probably going to give you better options than what you'd currently get in the forum, but anyway.
Well, at least you know that Tay hates you, right? Rather than that forum poster who seems so useful, but offers advice that's so destructive. Okay, here's another one. When you're creating a collection, what you do is you set a limiting collection. It's sort of like, this is the big set, and I want a smaller set of the big set. And the default thing that people do is that they go and say, we're going to use all systems, or all users, as our limiting collection. So needless to say, this slows things down quite a bit.
And there's so many other reasons why we don't like all systems, but don't worry, you know it's coming. You know it's coming, we won't let you down.
But the thing is with any set, right, when you want a subset of that set, what you want to do is you want to define your subset as close to where you're going as possible, okay? You don't want to go the big, big, big. You don't want to say, right, I want everybody who lives in Auckland out of the set of everybody that lives on planet Earth, right? Maybe you're sort of doing better if you say, I want everybody who lives in Auckland out of everybody who lives on the North Island. But you might be able to even get better than that. But that's the sort of thinking that you should put into it. And look at how your collections are constructed, because this is very important. Simply because, as you're aware, if you've actually built a query for a collection, it uses WQL instead of SQL.
Why do we still do that? We've been doing this since 1996, and obviously when WQL took over the world as the world's most premier query language, we were going to keep it. But something went wrong and it never happened. So why are we still doing WQL? Why don't we just hack the tables directly? Why don't we just query the tables directly?
We'll get to that.
Oh,
okay. But the thing with WQL is that WQL can cause locks and it can cause problems and it can certainly cause massive performance issues, even if what you have constructed looks like a reasonable query. So what you should do, there is a collection evaluator that's sort of an available tool. If you go and Bing it, you will find where that tool is. And then you can actually do a performance test against your queries. Because remember, as we mentioned before, single evaluation thread. If you've got a query, even if it looks like it's reasonable for the generation of collections, and some people are not really reasonable in the way that they generate collections. I mean, I've literally seen, let's create a collection of all people who've got Internet Explorer 5 and Word 2007 and you know...
And by the way, if you're still working in a place that does have Internet Explorer 5 and Word 2007, Just a quick tip, I'd be getting out of there reasonably soon.
Well, you know, I mean, sometimes they don't let people leave Tasmania, Macca.
True.
But go through and do, again, if someone else has built the queries, you don't know which queries are in your system and how they perform unless you go and do an evaluation on those queries. If you've got these custom collections that are query-based, go and check them out. Because it might be that simply that the way that the query's been put together, it might seem completely rational, but there's something going on at the back end that causes a big performance bottleneck. I've got a friend of mine, Greg Lowe, is a SQL god. And he can go in and he can look at queries and he can go, and he can improve query, performance by like tens of percentage points simply by going, well, you're doing it this way, and if you shifted these lines around and you did this first and then this first, this would improve your query. And it's things like that. And because systems administrators, we're getting better with SQL, but WQL's another thing. It's got its own sort of set of eccentricities that you need to take. So go in and have a look at how your queries are performing. Okay, next one we'll talk about is inventory and metering topics. Now, Macca, I want to know about all the hardware in my organisation.
No, you don't.
Should I go and enable every hardware class?
No.
Are you sure? Because
yes.
I'd learned so much.
I'm absolutely sure. How many PCM CIA modems do you still have plugged into your laptops?
But what about my fax cards?
What about your fax cards? I'm pretty sure you don't have any of those anymore as well.
So if you ports.
Just shut up. Right. Now that he's calmed down, he doesn't need to know about every piece of hardware inventory out there, because fundamentally, if you turn on every single inventory class, first of all, every machine's going to push out a 20 meg inventory file, at least the first time. Then we're going to do a little bit of delta. And most of that's going to be null. So you really don't need everything turned on. Sure, you might need to turn on a couple of extra classes if you do have some more unusual pieces of hardware out there, but fundamentally you don't need to have the whole thing on. Remember, this product has been around since 1996. Hardware has come a little way since 1996. There are still lots and lots of classes in WMI that are no longer really relevant to us in this day and age, so you don't need to turn everything on.
Okay, so why wouldn't I go and do hardware inventory every 15 minutes?
How often do you change your hardware? Seriously.
Well,
actually, I know this guy, right? Because Lenovo seems to send him a new PC every 5 seconds. So he does change his hardware quite a bit. All right, but I don't think he needs to be pushing out hardware inventory every 15 minutes. Definitely not. Now, I used to work at a university in Melbourne, in Victoria, in Australia. And admittedly, the machines in the student lab, the RAM would change every day. That's true. And I do believe you had something to do with that. Not that he had anything to do with the RAM going missing, but I do believe...
We worked at the same university 20 years ago.
I do believe he had access to the video footage, and thankfully he never found me.
If you ever want one of those wonderful jobs in IT that simply don't exist anymore, the University of Melbourne, for some reason, thought in the 90s it was a fantastic idea to give undergraduate students swipe card access, 24-hour swipe card access to a lab that had an external door. The University of Melbourne's right near the city district. So needless to say, what students would do is they'd go to the pub on Friday night, and they couldn't get home, but they could get to the computer lab.
Yeah, because, we all liked playing around with Pine and Lynx in those days.
No, it wasn't what they were doing in the computer lab at all. There were a lot of people then that didn't know about computers, but they knew about doing other things in computer labs.
Excellent.
Sort of like the stuff that people look at on computers.
So, back to hardware inventory.
So, if you enable software inventory, you can light it up, but there's a number of organisations that have lit up software inventory, but then haven't told it to look for anything. They've said, and then they've come back and said, well, we don't know what's in our inventory because we turned it on and it's not doing anything.
Because it doesn't. You turn it on, it goes, good, on you, Tiger.
I'll
just sit here until you tell me what to look for.
So, turn it on. Don't scan for new... Why wouldn't I scan for new software every 15 minutes? I mean, surely if I deploy something, I want to know if it's been there 15 minutes later.
Maybe not.
No, because what it does is it goes out and it asks every client to go and perform a scan, and then the client sort of sits there. We heard a story yesterday from one of our colleagues who was talking about when he was working for a particular government that's north of the United States. So you can probably figure out who we're talking about. He's in another theatre at the moment. Anyway, there was a particular performance benchmark that SMS used to do. Was it running video?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what happened is that some clever little sausage decided that every computer in the Canadian government needed to run...
Oh, you mean that country north of North America?
It could be false Canada, or no, I dug myself into that hole, didn't I? I just might as well enjoy myself in there. Anyway, 10 o'clock in the morning, every day, every computer ran this performance benchmark because someone didn't configure the offset. But you don't need to scan for new software every 15 minutes. You need to figure out what a reasonable introduction of software. Now, there is reasons to scan for software. We're seeing more and more, especially in certain environments with looser restrictions, people putting on Tor clients, people putting on BitTorrent clients. Interesting fact is that 30% of Fortune 500 companies have internal Tor traffic. So basically what people are doing is that they're using Tor to get around the corporate firewall. And you can use Configuration Manager as a way of going out and discovering things like that. But what you have to admit to yourself is understand the nature of Configuration Manager itself. And that's something that you might want to look for once a day rather than trying to detect it as soon as it happens.
And there's one other thing that you might want to think about too. You may have stumbled upon this in the documentation at one point and thought this is a pretty awesome way of improving my MP3 collection, and that is file collection. So one of the things that we can do with software inventory is actually collect files and store them in text fields in the database. Ouch. But hey, if you really want to go out and get some of those files, you can, but you only get a maximum of 20 meg, and that's not going to get you an awful lot of interesting stuff.
Don't meter everything. Okay, so software metering is a really interesting one. What it does is it tracks how often something is run. Meter what you need to know. You don't need to know how often someone opens Word. Where I've seen it used most effectively is where you have what I call premium applications. People who have demanded that they have Photoshop installed on their computer. Again, working at this particular university, we had this problem where we had all of these people that demanded basically what was going to cost us $2,000 a year in licensing product to be installed, and they basically organised for their head of department to make the case, and they got paid for and blah, blah, blah. So what we did eventually is we tracked how often they actually used the application, and I found that only 10% of the people that had Photoshop on their machine opened it more than once a month.
Visio and Project are also real classic examples of this sort of stuff. And one of the great things of software metering and the fact that we are gathering so much data and putting it in the database and then being able to utilise that data to build collections in the first place is that we can start doing things like looking for the non-utilisation of something like a Visio or a project for, let's say, 30 days. And then once that becomes true, your machine becomes a part of a collection that has an uninstall routine for Project or Visio attached to it, so that if you don't use the product in that amount of time, we get rid of it. Or maybe if you know that your Microsoft true-up is due at a certain date. No, maybe not. No, just ignore that bit.
He's got the blue badge. I'm dash trash. So,
right, there you go. The other thing to think about with software metering before we move on to the next thing is definitely think about using software metering for the stuff that you want to blacklist and get rid of straight away. So the idea of using software metering to look for the Tor client, to look for the microtorrent client or something like that, actually build an application object for that application inside Config Manager with an uninstall routine attached to it, and then immediately fire that as soon as we see that come up on a metering report. That's a really nice way of getting rid of stuff that shouldn't be there as well. It's also a great way if you've got users that are essentially localised administrators, of reducing them to a quivering, crying lump of jelly in the corner, because what happens is we discover the piece of software, we remove it. They put it back on, oh, it's there again, we remove it. They put it back on, oh, it's there again, we remove it. And we just keep doing that with a nice smug grin on our face while they're rocking back and forth in the corner, tears dribbling, the works. It's awesome.
Remember, okay, so I've seen, personally, people that are still running the version Configuration Manager 2007 ARC3 client on compute when they've got a Configuration Manager 2012 deployment. One of the things that you need to do is that when you get an update to Config Manager and you get an update to clients, you need to push the new clients out to your Configuration Manager clients. You also, depending on how you're deploying the client, if you've got it built into the image or if you've got it basically installing straight after, make sure that it's up to date. There's a lot of people that don't update their clients, and you will find that a lot of errors that creep in the new updates of the clients deal with those errors. So there's people reporting on the forums where they're going, oh, I've got this, such and such an error. How do I fix it? And the response is usually, well, have you got the latest Configuration Manager client installed? Because that will go and resolve that problem for you. Okay, now here's a big one.
Yeah.
Don't call a WMI repair script as a startup script for client computers.
It happens. There's one that's slightly worse than this, but this is pretty bad.
Right, so there's a lot of errors that will turn up in Config Manager where the advice that you'll find on Google is basically do a WMI rebuild. WMI rebuild is like a sledgehammer. Okay, it is absolutely a tool of last resort. I mean, you are literally better redeploying the client because of the mess you'll make with a WMI rebuild. Yet, there is someone in the world who configured all of their client computers every time they booted to go and do a WMI rebuild because they were trying to fix a Configuration Manager problem.
Now let's think about this a little bit. So what happens when we rebuild the WMI repository? Well, basically we tear the whole thing down, we put it back up again, we reinitialize the entire SIMOM, and then Config Manager client goes, new machine. Fantastic. Alrighty, I think I'd better do a full hardware inventory for a start. Now we know where this is going. Amongst other things, mind you, but the fact of the matter is that every time you do this, you get a great big blob of happiness thrown up at your management point, and then that, of course, is going to hit your database at some point, and we've got to funnel it in there as well. Not to mention potential other things that can go wrong. It's just not a really good idea. Now, we're not saying you're never ever going to have to do a WMI rebuild. We're absolutely not saying that. It will happen at some point to a machine, but it certainly doesn't have to happen every time they boot.
And there's a lot of people that will advise that on the internet who are very wrong. So the next one's fantastic just because there's a follow-up slide that describes what the person should do. So don't run a WMI repair task on site servers as a scheduled task.
Whoa, 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 hang on. Are you leaving the company under bad circumstances?
Now,
That's an awesome
this
idea.
is a response in the Microsoft forums to this. Gart, did you do this? I hope your resume is up to date. As to what kind of issues, well, it'll break everything and nothing will ever work again. Ever. Okay? So this is why you never do a WMI rebuild on a site server. One of my favourite responses in the Config Manager forums.
However, this person was so passionate about it that they had to go, ever, again. And you almost want that cliffhanger Doctor Who screaming music to come in over the top. Not a good idea. Just don't do it.
Follow up on your endpoint protection reports. So if you see someone who's getting a virus or they're getting malware all the time, go and check them out, okay? I was working with an organisation who had some clients out in Wagga Wagga. And what was happening was every day there was a bunch of malware detected in Wagga Wagga and it was cleaned. And then the next day...
That's actually called the inhabitants of Wagga Wagga, isn't it? Sorry.
I'm doing my doctorate out of a university in Wagga Wagga. They're not all Vogons. Anyway, so you follow up because ultimately what we found was that people were taking home their USB sticks with their work on them and they were plugging it into their home computer and they were getting infected with malware and then bringing it back into the office. So the way that we solved that problem was we did a clean of the malware on their home computers and then we had no more alerts. The other thing is that any antivirus protection system is only going to catch a certain percentage of malware that's in the wild. So if people are getting infected on a regular basis, it's not unreasonable to assume that they might have something else on their machine that System Center Endpoint Protection's not detecting that another solution would. So if someone's getting repeatedly infected, they're doing something. There's a user behavioural issue, okay? And even though the new thing is that we work security taking into account the needs of the users, sometimes we have certain types of users that have user behavioural issues.
But we can fix these with a 2x4 with a nail through it.
You see, I'm the one who's meant to say that because I'm not the full-time employee. The other thing with endpoint protection scans, you have basically a virus definition file. It's a text file. It was ICARs.
Yep.
Go and put that on machines occasionally just to see that you are getting the reports into endpoint protection. So if you're not seeing any antivirus activity or any malware activity in your organisation, it could be that your anti-malware reporting is rubbish. So go out and do some false positive testing just to see that you do get your alerts in.
Or it could be something to do with the next slide.
Follow up on problematic client computers and come up with a way of remediating them. Sometimes clients do not report back to Config Manager. Sometimes clients get lost. Figure out a way of dealing with it. Sometimes it's actually really good to just go and do a wipe and load on those clients, because rather than spending a couple of hours trying to dig into what the problem is, if all of their data is sitting on the network share, you can just basically wipe, reinstall, and then you're saving time and you're saving the organisation money. Check software updates have actually installed. We're going to have less of a problem with this by the middle of next year when we've got cumulative updates for Windows 7 going out. But at the moment, there are many computers that even if you push a software update package to them, might not properly install them or might get caught in a software update installation sort of cycle where they're waiting for the new one and they haven't done the old one, and then it's all getting jammed up and that's not getting installed. Eventually, you'll be able to push a cumulative update down and they'll be all up to date within reason. But at the moment, there's a lot of, I'm assuming, who here is primarily got a Windows 7 fleet?
Pending reboot is not your friend in that Windows 7 state. Pending reboot every single time on those earlier machines, absolutely. And they sit there and they get out of whack, and they get out of whack by several months, and it's just a bit of a nightmare.
Okay, in terms of managing Configuration Manager itself, when updates come down for Configuration Manager, apply them. Not only to the host operating system, but Config Manager itself. Now, with the new system of doing Config Manager, it's a lot easier, isn't it?
It's an awful lot easier. And to be honest, I would say I feel for you if you're on an earlier version of Config Manager, because we all know what applying a service pack to Config Manager was like in the past, don't we? And that's why you didn't do it, because you wanted the thing to work and continue working. And SMS and Config Manager service packs were always a thing of fear, to be treated with an awful lot of respect and preferably run away from. Well, these days, the servicing stack, similar to the way we do it in Windows and Config Manager, is very reliable and is definitely something you should be looking at. Just pushing out new pieces of functionality every month in a simple in-console update. It's a hell of a lot easier than it used to be, and it handles all of the updates to all of the site systems with no problems at all.
Make sure that you clean up your status logs and alerts.
Yep.
Now, you're never going to have a completely clean set of alerts.
Well, you will for the first 5 or 10 minutes after you install Config Manager, and you should cherish that point of your life, because you're going to go in there, you're going to look at the site status, and everything's going to be green. You're going to go, God, I'm good. And then 5 minutes later, yellow, red, warning. Yellow, warning, error, this, that, the other. And they're not necessarily problems. They're just, oh, we had a warning come up a couple of times, so damn it, let's flag the whole thing as red. It's screwed.
In a way, Config Manager is like a marriage, right? It's never going to be perfect, but you've got to figure out what problems really need to be dealt with.
We didn't do that
and
in
what
rehearsal.
problems you can kind of go, yes, dear.
We didn't do that bit in rehearsal.
Okay, yeah, you know,
But definitely clean these things up, right? Because what happens is they eventually get a little bit old. Every so often you want to reset those status messages, go from a clean slate, experience the glow of potentially having green for a little bit longer, and then make sure you're back into a good state and an up-to-date state.
Have you checked in your maintenance tasks recently?
Does anyone even remember where they are?
Make sure that you go and have a look. Are they running? What's going on? Okay? Some people kind of go, oh yeah. They get into a class and we get to the point where we're talking about maintenance class. And they go, oh gosh, I remember these. I haven't had a look at these in ages. And you're thinking, you're doing well. When was the last time you did a Configuration Manager backup or disaster recovery drill? Who here has done one in the last 6 months?
Who's done one because you accidentally went, check DB upgrade on the real one, oops, and destroyed it?
No one's admitting to that.
No one's going to admit to it. I've done that before.
Okay, database shenanigans. Don't forget about SQL Server. Pretty much unless you are running a huge site, really with more than several 100,000 clients, you can actually use SQL on the same server as your Config Manager server. The only time it sort of moves off there is if you're in one of those organisations that's got a weird siloing system where the SQL administrators are over here and the Config Manager administrators are over here. Also, with secondaries, SQL Express is fine. It does everything you need to do. You do not need to do a full version of SQL Server for Config Manager.
The one thing I would say too is your SQL Server administrator does not know better than you about how SQL Server should be set up or tuned for Config Manager. Because as soon as your SQL Server goes and installs SQL using their preferred methodology, I can almost guarantee you that the page is wrong, the code page is wrong for a start, because we have that requirement for a specific code page in SQL Server and a collation setting in SQL Server and stuff like that. So do not let them run roughshod over you. You are in charge of that SQL Server. And please remember to set that maximum memory if it's sitting on the same box as Config Manager.
So limit the amount of memory. So you can go into SQL Server and you can say only use 8 gig of memory, and then that will put a roof on how SQL Server will use their memory. Otherwise, it's basically like Pokemon that wants to catch them all, okay? It wants to have as much memory as it wants. It's sort of like Chrome. Oh, RAM. Yeah.
It's another possible one for the I'm about to leave the job and I'm a little bit miffed. Maybe you want to play around with that.
Now, don't ever go and manually edit the site database, even if you think that you are a SQL guru. There are so many hacks and tips and tricks, and it's basically one of those Gordian knots that you should simply not touch. Okay, so, and you'll get people in there going, no, I'm really good with SQL. I'm going to go and improve the Config Manager database. Let me run this query against the tables directly.
And you know what, you might be thinking that you can build some better reports in Microsoft, and potentially you can, and you want to start querying those tables directly. Don't do it. Query the views that we publish, because you don't know if we're going to go change something underneath that between one version of Config Manager and another, or one update to Config Manager or another. The views are there, they're documented. You want to actually run queries against the database, use the views. Don't hit the tables direct.
And don't play around with Config Manager database security.
Do not do that.
Do not. Okay, operating system deployment.
All right, this is the one you've all been waiting for, isn't it? Operating system deployment.
Okay, I was actually in Las Vegas a week and a half ago, and some guy came up to me and Kent Ugerland, and we were talking, and Kent does some amazing Config Manager presentations. And this guy came up and he had a particular WSUS problem. And Kent looked at him for a while, because Kent, that's all Kent does is Config Manager. And he said, are you deploying Windows 7 RTM to your clients? And the guy was like, yeah. And he said, well, do you know why you're getting that error with WSUS? And he said, no. He says, because Windows 7 RTM's hitting the network, and it's going to WSUS. What do I need to make myself up to date? And WSUS is going, well, let me get the list. And WSUS doesn't have enough memory for that, so WSUS was falling over. What this is really about is make sure that you keep your operating system deployment images reasonably up to date. Again, this is going to be less of a problem now that we're moving to a cumulative update framework. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that when the deployment happens, it happens in the most reasonable way possible.
Has anyone actually deployed an RTM version of Windows 7 recently? Or just a Service Pack 1 installation? Have you done it recently?
No one's going to admit to it.
No one's going to admit to it. Well, it is interesting because it takes around about 2.5 days to finish updating. Because what happens is the Windows Update agent itself is so hopelessly out of date that it goes off and asks for the new version, and it's almost like, how old are you? What? I don't think we've got that one anymore. hang on a minute. And it does. It gets itself into this perpetual attempt to update the Windows Update agent over and over and over again. And it literally takes about 2.5 days to get to where it needs to be. It's scary.
You don't need a new operating system deployment task sequence for each hardware build in your organisation.
Unless you're being paid by the hour. In which case, very, very good idea. Stuff this thing called task sequence variables and not necessary. Just build a task sequence for every single hardware variation model you've got. You'll be rich.
Okay, and the final one. This is where we started. Never, ever, 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 ever push an operating system image to all systems.
It has been seen, people screaming, running down the corridor in an attempt to start yanking blue cables from VM hosts. This is not a good thing at all. And this is the stuff you see published out there on the internet. This is the, I accidentally said, let's post that that rebuild to all systems, I think I'm going to be all right. In fact, we've gone so far now as to create an "Are you a moron" button in Config Manager. I don't know if you've ever seen it. You probably haven't because you've never tried to do this before. But if you do try to do that, it will say, "Are you really sure you want to do this? This is going to affect a lot of machines." Yes? Of course, yes, let's do that. Are you really sure? Yes. Are you absolutely certain you want to go down? Yes. Have you got a resume? Bloody oath. Go.
Okay, just before we get to Q&A, this is a friend of ours, James Bannon's written a Config Manager book. We can both recommend it. Learn Config Manager in a month of lunches. Probably, you guys are probably all sophisticated administrators and don't need this, but when you're bringing on your next Padawan, maybe this might be a good book for them. Anyway, that's pretty much most of our... You know how to turn off one of those? Most of our time, we're happy to answer any questions.
We're actually exactly at time, I think.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
Excellent. So otherwise, come up with us or please, please, please do your evaluations. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
You've been
guys.
a wonderful audience.